the first thing you want to start with is basically, let's call it the longer term productivity cycle, which drives, anytime you're thinking about growth over 20, 30-year time frame, that's productivity is the main thing that drives what's going on. And we've basically, I think the thing that you typically see is the productivity, particularly in advanced Western economies, is pretty stable over time. There's some fluctuations here and there, but by and large, productivity is consistent. And that most of the evolution of productivity that you see, or the changes in productivity, are more cyclically driven and driven by other factors rather than real, true productivity dynamics. I do think there's a big, that being said, there is a productivity cycle, particularly in the context of a global, particularly in the context of the development of an overall, like a societal development, which is in the West, let's just say the developed West, we've gone from, 75 years ago being innovative and hardworking to being less innovative and less hardworking today. And so you'd expect productivity to moderate. So the types of productivity gains that existed, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s are unlikely to persist. So we're seeing productivity slow to sort of that, 1-ish% kind of level. Take labor force growth at close to zero in most Western developed economies, and productivity growth about 1. You actually don't need that much economic growth to have some tightening in the overall market. And I think that context is actually somewhat important when we think about what's going on, today, which is you see places like Europe or the US put up GDP numbers of, 0, 1, 2%. That is very different. That's not that bad. This is in the grand scheme of things, and very different from where we were, say, 20 years ago, when a 1% growth rate or a 0% growth rate was actually quite a contractionary dynamic. And so it creates some risks around using previous cycles as benchmarks to looking at today's cycle. So you take that.
Sorry, Bob, if I could just interrupt you for one sec there. Yeah. When we're thinking about these, these labor force growth rates, is a lot of that just due to demographics?
Yeah, that's just a demographic issue.
Okay.
And, on the margin, advanced Western economies could possibly increase immigration to the extent that it could be beneficial to their labor force growth. But those things are pretty on the margin. They're, the big picture story for most of these economies is that they have aging populations. And the result of an aging population is you get lower labor force growth, and therefore overall lower overall growth, lower nominal growth, and real growth on a structural basis. That actually ties nicely to the debt cycle, because typically the way that economies that are in the later stages of labor and productivity cycle is you typically start borrowing to make up for the fact that you can no longer produce as high a rate as you did before to maintain a continued standard of living. And that's really what we've done in the advanced Western economies over the course of the last, say, 30 or 40 years. It was obviously helped a great deal by the fact that you had a secular decline in interest rates as inflation became more controlled relative to where it was back in the 60s and 70s. And that helped stimulate an incredible amount of debt growth. And that debt growth basically flowed into a fair amount of consumption, maintaining consumption growth that was stronger than underlying productivity plus labor force growth, and also flowed a lot into asset prices.